December 19th, 1941. Joseph Stalin stood by a window inside the Kremlin, watching snow drift quietly over Moscow. In the frozen air, the dull thud of German artillery could be heard, close enough to feel uncomfortably real. The Wehrmacht had reached the outskirts of the city. Soviet casualties had already passed 800,000 men. And then, threading their way through the streets below, came something Stalin had never imagined seeing in the capital of world socialism: a column of American tanks. Their white stars were barely visible, buried under layers of ice, mud, and road grime. Stalin said nothing at first. He simply watched. The tanks moved slowly, steel tracks clattering against the cobblestones, exhaust rising in pale white clouds. M3 Stuarts, light tanks that almost looked like toys compared to the German panzers his armies had been fighting for months. Behind them rolled the larger M3 Lees, medium tanks with a strange, awkward profile, their main gun mounted in a side sponson. On the right of the hull, American machines, built in Detroit, shipped halfway around the world, now rolling through Moscow to help defend it. What Stalin said in that moment depends entirely on who you ask. The official Soviet record, when it mentioned the episode at all, claimed he nodded with approval and spoke of the fraternal solidarity of the anti-fascist alliance. American diplomats who met him that same week remembered something colder: a grudging acknowledgement that the tanks had arrived, mixed with barely concealed irritation that the Soviet Union needed them in the first place. Soviet tank officers, men who would later crew these vehicles, told a different story. According to them, Stalin's first concern wasn't politics at all, but performance. Were the tanks any good? Could American capitalism really build weapons that matched German engineering? The truth was, probably all of these things at once. Stalin was a man of contradictions, pragmatic and ideological, grateful and resentful, impressed and dismissive, sometimes all within the same conversation. To understand what those American tanks truly meant, you have to rewind 4 months, back to a moment when Stalin believed he didn't need Western help at all. June 22nd, 1941. 3 million German soldiers smashed across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Stalin had ignored warning after warning. He believed Hitler wouldn't be reckless enough to fight a two-front war. He convinced himself the German troop buildups were a bluff, that the non-aggression pact would hold, that there was still time. He was wrong. Within days, entire Soviet armies vanished. The Red Air Force lost more than 1,200 aircraft in the first 9 hours alone. German panzer units drove so deep and so fast that Soviet commanders no longer knew where the front line even was. Minsk fell. Smolensk followed. By September, Leningrad was under siege, and German forces were driving straight toward Moscow. Stalin's initial response bordered on paralysis. For nearly 2 weeks after the invasion, he barely appeared in public. When he finally chatly addressed the nation on July 3rd, his voice carried something unfamiliar: uncertainty. "A grave danger hangs over our country," he said. It was not the usual confident proclamation of inevitable socialist victory. It was an admission, rare and unsettling, that the Soviet Union might actually lose. And in that moment of crisis, help came from the least expected direction: the capitalist West. Britain had already been fighting Germany alone for more than a year. Winston Churchill, a man who had spent much of his political life warning against Bolshevism, who had once argued for strangling the Soviet state in its cradle back in 1918, made a cold, practical calculation. "If Hitler invaded hell," Churchill said, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. The enemy of my enemy, even if that enemy was Stalin." But Britain itself was stretched to the breaking point. Its survival depended heavily on American support. The real question was, whether the United States would help the Soviet Union at all. That decision rested with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt was walking a political tightrope. He wanted to support Britain while keeping America officially neutral. He faced an American public deeply opposed to another European war, and a Congress that viewed Stalin's regime as scarcely better than Hitler's. His solution was Lend-Lease. The program allowed Roosevelt to send weapons and supplies to nations fighting the Axis without calling it a sale, without demanding immediate payment, and without technically violating neutrality laws. Roosevelt explained it to the American public with a simple metaphor. "If my neighbor's house catches fire," he said, "and I have a garden hose, I don't sell him the hose. I lend it to him so he can put out the fire." Lend-Lease had been designed for Britain. But after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Roosevelt made a decision that shocked many Americans. He extended it to Stalin. On August 2, 1941, less than 6 weeks after the German invasion, Roosevelt announced that the United States would provide military aid to the USSR. Stalin's response was blunt and immediate. "Send everything. Send it now." Soviet purchasing agents in Washington submitted lists of required supplies that bordered on the surreal: tanks, aircraft, trucks, locomotives, railroad rails, telephone wire, machine tools, aluminum, steel, explosives, food, boots, medicine, millions of tons of nearly everything imaginable. The Americans and British sent a joint delegation to Moscow to work out the details. Averell Harriman represented the United States, a wealthy businessman turned diplomat, now seated across from Stalin in the Kremlin, discussing how many tanks and planes America could realistically deliver. Stalin chain-smoked throughout the meeting, pacing the room, stopping occasionally to stare at maps showing the German advance. "The situation is grave," Stalin admitted. It was not a phrase he used lightly. "We need immediate help, not promises. We need weapons now." Harriman tried to explain the reality. America's own military was still small. Factories were only beginning to shift into wartime production. Britain had priority because it had been fighting longer. Shipping lanes were threatened by U-boats. Stalin cut him off. "Every month of delay costs us hundreds of thousands of lives," he said. "Your factories are safe. Ours are being overrun. We need tanks. We need aircraft. How many can you send?" They settled on the first protocol. The United States and Britain would deliver 400 aircraft and 500 tanks per month, along with raw materials and other supplies. The agreement was signed on October 1, 1941, with deliveries to begin immediately. Immediately, however, proved far more complicated than anyone expected. The problem was geography. The Soviet Union and the United States shared no border. Getting American weapons to Soviet soldiers meant moving them across thousands of miles of ocean, ice, desert, and hostile territory. 3 supply routes slowly emerged, each with its own dangers. The Arctic route ran from American ports to Britain, then north around German-occupied Norway to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, Soviet ports on the Barents Sea. These convoys faced German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft operating from Norway. They also sailed through some of the harshest weather on Earth. Waves could snap a ship in half. Ice built up so fast on decks that vessels sometimes capsized under the weight. The Pacific route ran from the American West Coast to Vladivostok. It was relatively safe from German attack, but it came with political complications. The ships had to be Soviet, since the United States was not yet at war with Japan and could not risk American vessels in Japanese-controlled waters. Even after Pearl Harbor, the route remained sensitive, and Vladivostok was nearly 6,000 miles from Moscow, linked only by the already overburdened Trans-Siberian Railway. The third option was the Persian Corridor. Supplies would travel from American ports through the Indian Ocean to Iran, then move north overland into Soviet territory. But Iran was officially neutral. To make the route usable, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran in August 1941, removed the government, and spent months building roads, ports, and rail lines to support the flow of supplies. None of these routes would be fully operational before winter, and winter was exactly when the Germans reached Moscow. The first American tanks arrived in the Soviet Union in early November 1941, shipped via the Arctic route to Arkhangelsk. About 20 M3 Stuart light tanks, just over 13 tons each, armed with a 37mm gun and several machine guns. From the port, they were loaded onto rail cars and sent south toward Moscow. Soviet tank officers examined them with open skepticism. The M3 Stuart was smaller than Soviet light tanks, more cramped inside. Its armor was thin, just over an inch at its thickest. The 37mm gun could handle light vehicles, but struggled against German medium tanks. Soviet crews nicknamed it Brat, the little brother, both affectionate and dismissive. Yet the Stuart had advantages Soviet tanks often lacked. It was reliable. Its engine started in cold weather that disabled many Soviet vehicles. Its transmission didn't fail every few dozen miles. Every tank had a radio, not just command vehicles. The crew layout was more practical, with better visibility. American tankers might have found it tight. Soviet crews thought it felt roomy by comparison. Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, who would later become one of the Red Army's most successful tank commanders, first encountered American tanks in December 1941. "We approached them with curiosity and suspicion," he later wrote. "They looked strange. The angles were different. The hatches opened differently. Everything felt foreign." His crew climbed inside a Stuart, tested the controls, and started the engine. "It started immediately," Loza remembered. "In winter, on the first try." The crew exchanged glances. That alone was remarkable. The larger M3 Lee medium tanks arrived soon after, and they were stranger still. The Lee carried two main guns, a 75mm mounted in a side sponson on the right of the hull, and a 37mm gun in a small turret above it. The design was an awkward compromise, the result of American engineers being unable, at the time, to fit a 75mm gun into a fully rotating turret. The outcome was a tall tank, over 10 feet high, with limited traverse for its main weapon and a massive silhouette that made it easy to spot. Soviet crews disliked it immediately. They called it a grave for seven brothers, a grim reference to its large crew. Its height made it an obvious target for German gunners. Firing the sponson-mounted gun required exposing most of the tank. Worse still, the riveted armor had a dangerous flaw. When hit, rivets could break loose and ricochet around the interior like bullets, turning the tank into a death trap. But Stalin was not interested in crew opinions. He cared about numbers. The Germans were at Moscow's gates. Soviet tank production had collapsed as factories were dismantled and evacuated east ahead of the advancing Wehrmacht. The Red Army was desperate for armor. American tanks, whatever their shortcomings, were better than no tanks at all. The first convoy to reach Moscow itself arrived in mid-December, just as Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive. The timing was accidental, but the symbolism was powerful. As German troops began their first retreat of the war, American tanks rolled through Red Square. That was when Stalin went to the window and watched them pass. What he said afterward depends on whose account you believe. Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, later claimed, Stalin remarked, "Roosevelt has finally made good on his promise. Now we will see whether American workers can build weapons as well as they build automobiles." It was at best a backhanded compliment. Anastas Mikoyan, another Politburo member, remembered it differently. "They've sent us their obsolete junk," Stalin supposedly said, "but junk is better than nothing." He reportedly smiled slightly, aware of the irony that the world's largest socialist state was being aided by capitalist industry. American diplomat William Stanley, who met Stalin shortly after the tanks arrived, recorded yet another version. Stalin expressed satisfaction that the Americans had kept their schedule, then immediately demanded more. "The protocol specifies 500 tanks per month," Stalin said. "I see 20. Where are the rest?" Soviet tank officers who witnessed the scene told a more personal story. According to them, Stalin inspected the tanks himself, walked around an M3 Lee, climbed up to peer inside, then turned to the officers and asked, "Can we build this?" When told that Soviet factories were producing superior designs, Stalin reportedly replied, "Then why are we accepting these?" No one answered him. The truth, unspoken, was that Soviet factories were producing almost nothing at that moment. They were being evacuated, dismantled, or captured. The most reliable account comes from Avril Harriman's notes. Harriman met Stalin on December 23rd, 4 days after the tanks arrived. Stalin acknowledged their delivery briefly, then spent the rest of the meeting demanding more tanks, more aircraft, more trucks, more aluminum. "You have sent us 20 tanks," Stalin said. "The Germans have 2,000 around Moscow. You see the difference." Harriman tried to explain that more tanks were already on the way, that convoys were at sea, and that American production was accelerating. Stalin cut him off with a question that revealed his deepest fear. "Will you continue sending supplies if we are forced back beyond the Urals?" he asked. "If Moscow falls, if we are reduced to partisan warfare?" It was the question that haunted Stalin throughout that winter. Lend-Lease depended on the Soviet Union, surviving as an organized state, one capable of tying down German divisions that might otherwise be used against Britain or eventually against the United States. If the Soviet state collapsed, the aid would stop. Stalin understood this clearly. "We will continue to send supplies as long as you continue to fight," Harriman assured him. "The president has committed to this." Stalin nodded slowly, drew on his cigarette, and replied with a line Harriman recorded in his notes, but which never appeared in Soviet histories. "Then we are in your debt," Stalin said. "I dislike debt." This captured the contradiction at the heart of Stalin's attitude toward American aid. He needed it desperately. He resented needing it. He appreciated it. He distrusted American motives. He demanded more even as he sought to prove the Soviet Union could stand alone. As additional American tanks arrived, Soviet crews formed more balanced opinions. The M3 Stuart light tanks proved useful for reconnaissance and infantry support, where reliability mattered more than protection. The M3 Lee mediums were pushed to secondary sectors or training units, considered too vulnerable for intense frontline combat. Still, in early 1942, when Soviet armor was at its weakest, even the Lees were used in fighting around Moscow and later near Kharkov. Then came the M4 Sherman. The Sherman corrected many of the Lee's flaws. It had a lower profile, a fully rotating turret, improved armor, and excellent mechanical reliability. Soviet crews called it MCHA, their pronunciation of M4. Unlike the Lee, which they mocked, the Sherman earned genuine respect. Dmitry Loza, who later commanded a Sherman unit, wrote, "The Sherman was the best tank for our conditions, not because it was better armed or armored than German tanks, but because it worked. It started in winter. It didn't break down. The crew could fight in it for hours without exhaustion." Soviet tankers especially valued features American crews took for granted. Electric turret traverse eliminated the need for constant hand cranking. The gyroscopic stabilizer helped keep the gun on target while moving. Wet ammunition storage reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. Spring-loaded hatches could be opened instantly in an emergency. They also noticed its weaknesses. The 75mm gun struggled against heavy German armor. The gasoline engine was more flammable than Soviet diesel engines. The tank's height made it easier to spot. Crews added spare track links, sandbags, and improvised armor wherever they could. By mid-1942, American tanks were arriving in large numbers. More than 3,000 Shermans would eventually reach the Soviet Union, along with over 1,000 M3 Lees and nearly 2,000 M3 Stewarts. Altogether, they made up roughly 15% of Soviet tank strength, important but not decisive. Publicly, Stalin downplayed Lend-Lease. In speeches, he emphasized Soviet production and sacrifice, barely mentioning Allied aid. In meetings with Western leaders, he acknowledged the assistance, but always followed with demands for more, complaints about delays, or calls for a second front in Europe. Privately, he was more honest. Nikita Khrushchev later recalled Stalin admitting that without American trucks, Soviet artillery could not have moved. Without American aluminum, aircraft production would have stalled. Without American food, the country might have starved. The famous remark attributed to Stalin, that without American production the United Nations could not have won the war, was spoken to Harriman in private, never meant for public record. The truth was complicated. Soviet industry, once relocated beyond the Urals, eventually outproduced Germany. Soviet designs like the T-34 were superior in armor and firepower. The Red Army bore the main burden of fighting and suffered the overwhelming majority of casualties. The Soviet Union likely would have won without Lend-Lease, but the war would have lasted longer and millions more lives would have been lost. Tanks were never the most important part of Lend-Lease. Trucks mattered more, over 400,000 of them. Food mattered more. Raw materials mattered more. But tanks were visible. Tanks were symbolic. When American tanks rolled through Moscow in December 1941, they were proof the Soviet Union was not alone. Proof that ideological enemies could unite against fascism. Proof that Stalin's gamble, accepting help from historical rivals, had paid off. What Stalin said mattered less than what he did. He accepted the tanks. He used them. He demanded more. And he never publicly admitted how much the Soviet Union relied on them. This was Stalin's way. Pride locked in tension with pragmatism. Gratitude expressed as demand. Dependence disguised as criticism. Lieutenant Loza captured it best. We knew the tanks were American. We saw the English manuals, the markings painted over. We were told to consider them Soviet tanks built by Soviet workers. We understood why national pride required that. But inside the tank, when the engine started at -40, when the radio worked, when the gun fired true, we knew the truth. And we were grateful, even if we could never say it. The first American tanks arrived during Moscow's darkest hour, when German guns could be heard from the Kremlin and Soviet casualties were nearing 1 million. They were not saviors, but reinforcements. Not a solution, but a supplement to Soviet resistance. Stalin watched them pass through snow-covered streets and said something. We will never know exactly what. But what followed mattered far more. Moscow held. The Germans retreated. The war turned. American steel, Soviet blood, British resolve, all fused together in the brutal arithmetic of total war. The tanks rolled through Red Square, their white stars painted over with red ones, their origins slowly erased from official memory. But they were there, when the city held, when the tide began to shift, and when history quietly took a more complicated path than any single quote could capture.